My own son-in-law forged my signature and stole the company I built for 30 years. I found out when my access was revoked overnight. I sat in my kitchen at 3 a.m., hands shaking, wondering how many lies I had missed. He thought I'd walk away quietly. But what happens when a woman loses everything? Except the truth. I remember the scuff marks on the training room floor, the corners where the old mats curled up from years of overuse, the little dent on the stainless steel fridge in the staff lounge where someone once backed into it with a wheelchair. Small, lived-in flaws. They meant something to me. That floor, those corners, that fridge. I bought them all, every chipped tile and loose screw. I knew them like my own hands, because I built that place, 30 years. I built Whitaker Health Training Center from the ground up, from folding chairs in a church basement to 3 locations across the state. We trained home health aides, medical assistants, caregivers, mostly women, many single mothers. Some older women like me, starting over after divorce or loss. I believed in second chances. I gave hundreds of women a path back into the world. That morning, I walked through the main office like I had every morning for decades. Coffee in hand, low heels, a burgundy wool coat, my name still on the plaque by the front door. Inside, the energy felt different. The receptionist glanced at me too quickly and turned back to her screen. She didn't smile. Neither did the operations manager, who usually waved from the hallway. I checked my email on my phone. Nothing unusual, just the usual admin notices and insurance policy updates, until I reached the last one, sent at 6:02 a.m. Change of access protocol effective immediately. Attached was a memo, formal language, legal tone. The new managing director, Ronan Fairchild, announced updates to the company structure. System access would be restricted pending credential re-evaluation. I scrolled down, looking for my name. There it was. Effective immediately, Dolores Whitaker will step back from active operations pending board confirmation. I stood frozen in the middle of the hallway. I hadn't called for a board vote. I hadn't even been informed one was happening. I was the founder, the largest shareholder, or so I thought. I walked straight into the server room, tried my admin badge. Red light. Access denied. Something inside me dropped. I walked faster, heart tight, toward Ronan's new corner office, a space I had once used for storage. His door was ajar. He was standing behind the desk, arms crossed, suit pressed, calm as a statue. He looked up, didn't flinch. "I was just going to call you," he said, like he was talking to a client. "There's been a shift. Temporary." I asked him what he meant. He handed me a manila folder. Inside were signed board minutes, my signature at the bottom. I didn't remember signing anything. And then it hit me. Months ago, he had brought papers to my house, claimed they were for a licensing update. We had just eaten dinner with Sienna, my daughter. I signed without reading closely. He had used my trust, my name, my signature. I said nothing. I took the folder, nodded, and walked out. Down the hall, past the receptionist, into the parking lot, into my car. I didn't cry, not yet. Instead, I drove to the hill near Cedar Avenue, the spot where I used to park when we couldn't afford office space, where I once took phone calls from job agencies on a prepaid flip phone. I parked there again. I sat with my hands in my lap and stared straight ahead. They didn't just take the company. They used me to do it. That was the part I couldn't shake. And maybe you understand what that feels like. When the betrayal isn't loud or violent, when it slips in quietly, wearing a familiar face, using your own handwriting. I stayed there for 2 hours. Then I turned on the ignition, drove home, and began to gather everything. Contracts, emails, dates, voice memos. If they thought I would go quietly, they had forgotten who I used to be before I became someone's mother-in-law, before I gave them everything, and before I lost it. 2 months before everything collapsed, we had dinner at my house. Just the four of us. Me, Sienna, Ronan, and their youngest, Ava. It was a quiet Sunday evening in early spring, the kind where the light lingers past 7, and you can almost believe everything is still whole. I had made lemon chicken, roasted carrots, and warm rolls from scratch. Ava, always picky, mostly pushed her food around, but she smiled when I gave her extra rolls wrapped in a napkin. Sienna looked tired. Her job at the hospital was weighing on her, long shifts and not enough sleep. Ronan, on the other hand, looked too relaxed. He sipped from his wine glass and asked about my plans for expansion. He kept bringing up licensing and corporate restructuring. I remember thinking, he's too interested in paperwork for someone who once told me he hated admin work. But I brushed it off. Families grow. Businesses shift. I thought he just wanted to be involved. I wanted to believe that. After dessert, he pulled out a folder. Said it was nothing urgent, just some state compliance forms, things to keep us protected as we expanded training into neighboring counties. I didn't even read them closely. I signed. It was late, and I was tired. I trusted him. Trusted Sienna. Trusted that this was still a family effort. Now, in hindsight, I see it all differently. Those forms gave him temporary signing authority. Enough to call a board meeting. Enough to reroute voting shares under a management clause buried deep in the bylaws. A clause I had written myself 15 years ago when I was trying to make the company more attractive to investors. I had forgotten it existed. He didn't. After that dinner, I remember walking them to the door. Sienna kissed my cheek, half asleep on her feet. Ronan thanked me, smiling, and offered to help with the trash. I told him I was fine. He paused, hand on the doorknob, and said something strange. "You've built something remarkable here. You should start thinking about how you want it remembered." I didn't think twice about it. I thought it was a compliment. But now I realize it was the first hint. The quiet suggestion that I should start stepping aside. In the weeks that followed, Ronan started taking more meetings without me. Claimed the licensing boards preferred to speak with someone more operational. I didn't argue. I let him handle it. I was preparing a new curriculum module, working on digital access for remote learners. I was busy, distracted, and he was taking advantage of every minute. What makes betrayal hurt is never the act itself. It's the time you spend not seeing it, the lunches you share, the emails you forward, the holidays you invite them to, all the ways you made space for them, not knowing they were moving in to replace you. One afternoon, I arrived at the center to find our supplier in the parking lot. He said the billing contact had changed. Everything was now under Ronan's office. I told him there must be a mistake. I called Sienna that night, casually mentioned it. She sounded surprised too, but said she'd ask him. She never called back. Then came the morning I walked in and found the server room locked. By then, everything had already been signed. It all led back to that one dinner, that folder, that signature. I sat at my kitchen table, going over every conversation, every odd glance, every slight shift in tone. I kept thinking I should have noticed. I should have pushed back. But the truth is, when you love someone, especially your child, you don't look for betrayal. You look for reassurance. You look for a reason to keep believing they see you, respect you, still need you. I looked through my records that night. I found a backup USB I hadn't used in years. It held copies of old board bylaws, including the management clause Ronan had activated. I opened my file cabinet. pulled old shareholder agreements, my original founding charter, even dusty email threads from past partners. Slowly, painfully, the picture became clear. He hadn't just betrayed me. He had studied me. He knew I still kept physical documents, that I didn't fully trust cloud storage, that I valued legacy and tradition over control. And he used it all. Worse than that was Sienna's silence. Not a word, no email, no call, no note slipped under my door. That hurt more than anything Ronan could have done. I had expected more from her, not defense, not outrage, just honesty. But maybe she didn't know the full extent. Or maybe she did, and chose to look away. I couldn't decide which was worse. That night, I wrote a letter of resignation, clean, formal, precise. But instead of sending it to the internal HR inbox, I addressed it to every member of the board. And I blind copied one more recipient. Someone outside the company entirely. Someone I hadn't contacted in years. The regional field office of the SEC. I didn't know what they would do with it. But it was no longer just about me. If Ronan had forged my signature, if financials had been shifted without proper disclosure, then we were in deeper waters than just family betrayal. And I wasn't going to be the one who drowned to keep his name clean. By Tuesday morning, I had printed every document I could find. Old emails, board resolutions, scanned agreements, and most importantly, the copy of my signature Ronan had misused. I tucked them into a thick manila envelope and sealed it shut like I was closing a chapter I hadn't agreed to end. I drove downtown just after sunrise. The SEC regional office was quiet that early. A few people passed me in the hallway, young and brisk in their movements, coffee in one hand and lanyards swinging. I felt out of place in my long navy coat and quiet shoes, carrying a story no one had asked to hear, but that I could no longer keep to myself. At the reception desk, I told the woman my name and said I had documents to submit regarding potential corporate fraud and signature falsification. I didn't over-explain. I didn't try to convince her of anything. I just handed the envelope over and asked for a time-stamped receipt. She blinked at me, then slowly took the package and printed the form. I signed it and walked away. That was all I needed. I didn't look back. When I got home, the house was silent. I left my coat on the back of the dining chair and sat at the kitchen table. My phone buzzed with a notification from my cloud drive. A backup had failed. I ignored it. That part of my life was crumbling by the hour, and I was strangely calm. The next part came faster than I expected. On Thursday afternoon, I got a call from Tasha. She was my former assistant director, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had been with the centre for 9 years. She had been in meetings all day and said something strange was going on. Ronan had moved up a vendor review to an unscheduled Friday morning meeting. He had brought in a new accountant, one no one recognized. I asked her what she thought it meant. She paused before saying, in that low, careful tone of hers, that she didn't think this was about vendors at all. She believed Ronan was scrambling, and she had one reason why. The SEC had contacted the company. Someone from their compliance review division had reached out with a preliminary inquiry. No formal charges, not yet. But they had questions about internal financial transfers, particularly a set of consulting payments made to a shell company, payments that totaled over $4 million in the last fiscal year. I closed my eyes and let that sink in. 4 million. It wasn't just a power grab. He was moving money. Suddenly, every strange purchase, every vague budget note, every contractor invoice made sense. He had set up a parallel payment structure under the guise of consulting fees, spread across 3 LLCs, one of which listed a mailing address to a storage unit in Nevada. And somehow the board had signed off on all of it, either blindly or worse, knowingly. Tasha said she didn't want to get involved unless she had to, but she was saving copies of everything she could access from her end. Quietly, carefully. I thanked her. She didn't owe me anything, but I could hear something shifting in her voice. That same dull ache I had felt weeks ago when I first realized what was being taken from me. It was more than business. It was a violation of trust that left bruises in places you couldn't see. That night, I sat at my desk, pulled out an old spiral notebook, and started listing names. Not enemies, not even allies, just names of people who had passed through that company with integrity, people who had given real time and effort, whose signatures meant something when they signed. And I made a second list, one for those who had stayed silent, those who had quietly let Ronan consolidate power, who hadn't asked questions, who had voted yes because it was easier than challenging the new order. The second list was longer than I expected. It made me realize that this wasn't just Ronan's scheme. It was a culture shift I hadn't noticed until it was too late. I had created something meant to empower. Somehow, along the way, I had stopped watching the ground it stood on. I went to bed late, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, Sienna called. Her voice was strained. She said she had heard from someone on the board that I had involved the SEC. I told her I had. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. But her silence was heavier than either. She finally asked why. I told her because I couldn't protect what didn't exist anymore, that whatever we had built, it had already been taken. All I could do now was protect its memory, its name, the women who had walked through its doors and deserved better than this mess. She said nothing. Then she hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand and waited for something else. A text, a knock, a return call. Nothing came. Just silence. By that afternoon, I got another email, this time from a lawyer representing the board, requesting a formal statement and reminding me of my non-disclosure clauses. I forwarded the email directly to the SEC contact, then shut my laptop. This was no longer a family matter. It was something else now, and I had stepped into it with my eyes open. I didn't sleep that night. The email from the board's attorney sat open on my laptop screen. Cold, efficient. Phrases like internal disruption and potential defamation. A veiled threat, carefully worded to avoid legal exposure but designed to intimidate. I knew that tone. I had written letters just like it, long ago, before I stepped down from legal oversight to focus on expansion. Now it was being used on me. By morning, my back ached from hours hunched over the kitchen table, revisiting files, charts, timelines. The house was quiet. I missed the sound of Sienna's footsteps. We hadn't spoken since I told her what I had done. She hadn't slammed the door or shouted, just stared at me like I had broken something fragile. The silence cut deeper than any accusation. I left her a note by the coffee pot and drove to meet Tasha again. This time, we met in the back corner of a small bookstore. No paper trail, no cameras, just two women surrounded by second-hand fiction and the smell of old ink. She brought what I had asked for, a list of board members, past and present, who had quietly sold their stock back to the company at discounted rates. 5 names. Each transaction processed through a trust registered in Wyoming, hidden behind shell corporations. The dates aligned too neatly with the time Ronan began pushing for full control. Tasha handed over one final document, a scanned image of a memo Ronan had sent to the CFO 3 months ago. The language was masked, almost sterile, but the subtext was clear. They were laundering consulting fees into operational losses, burying them across subsidiary accounts. It was methodical, clinical, greedy, and it had my signature at the bottom. That stopped me. My breath caught, my chest tightened. I stared at the fake initials scribbled in a style I once used when I was in a hurry. It was disturbingly close. Close enough to pass a surface audit. That's when I knew this wasn't just about removing me. It wasn't about succession or vision or even ego. This was premeditated fraud. And he needed me gone because I was the only one who remembered where the bodies were buried. I drove home slower than usual. The house felt too still. I walked past Sienna's room. Her door was open. Her suitcase was gone. On the kitchen table, she had left behind a note of her own. 4 words in her careful handwriting. You were right. Sorry. No explanations. No forwarding address. Just absence. I folded the paper in half and held it for a long while. Then I placed it in the drawer beside my grandmother's recipe cards. I couldn't deal with that pain yet. Instead, I went to work. I called a lawyer, not someone from the old firm, someone younger, hungrier. Her name was Layla. She specialized in white-collar litigation and had once brought down a biotech CEO for insider trading using nothing but internal memos and calendar metadata. She didn't flinch when I told her who I was or what I suspected. She asked for everything. I gave her copies of the memo, the board transactions, and the altered signature. She didn't promise revenge. She promised clarity. While she began her quiet investigation, I turned to an older tactic. Memory. I dusted off the filing cabinet in the garage. My late husband had kept everything. Receipts, printouts, old meeting minutes from the early years. I found a manila folder labeled West Shore Acquisition, 1998. Inside were notes from the deal that gave our company its international foothold. That name showed up again in Ronan's memos. West Shore had been dissolved in 2009, or so I thought. Except it hadn't. Not legally. The company had been renamed, folded into a holding group and used again, this time as a shell to route fees. Ronan hadn't built anything new. He had just scavenged old architecture, like a vulture feeding on the remains of our life's work. That night, I sat in the dark, my notes spread across the dining table. I used color-coded markers, just like I used to. Yellow for active accounts, red for conflicts, green for buried entities. By midnight, a pattern emerged. The fraud wasn't isolated, it was systemic. Years in the making. He wasn't afraid of me going to the press. He was afraid I'd remember enough to make it stick. And I did. That realization didn't bring relief. It brought a cold sort of calm. Ronan had underestimated what a woman remembers when she has nothing left to lose. The next day, I mailed a second package to the SEC. This one with hard evidence. Not just suspicions, not just instinct. This one had dates, documents, signatures, backdoor transfers, and legal inconsistencies. I didn't sign it with my name. I used the alias we used to file whistleblower claims in the early days. It was a name only 2 people would recognize. My husband. And me. By dusk, I was back in my garden, trimming the rosemary bush. The wind was soft, the light golden. That evening, for the first time in weeks, I slept. Not peacefully, but without panic. Something had shifted. I was no longer just a woman who had lost everything. I was a woman who remembered. The next few days moved slowly, but my mind didn't. I found myself staring at the smallest things for minutes at a time. A tea stain on the countertop, the curve of my old garden shears, the hum of the refrigerator in the silence. I wasn't sad. Not really. I was suspended, like something had cracked open inside me, but I didn't yet know what to do with the light pouring in. The garden helped. Not because it made the pain go away, but because pulling weeds felt like pulling something else out of me. Regret, maybe. Anger, too. Every time my hands went into the soil, I remembered the meetings Ronan used to sit in with me, asking questions like he cared, like he wanted to learn. I had thought I was mentoring him. I had thought I was passing on a legacy. Now I realized I was handing over a loaded weapon. One morning, a blue sedan pulled up in front of my house. I didn't move from the porch. A woman stepped out, briefcase in hand. It was Layla. She greeted me with a nod and no small talk. That was something I liked about her. Efficient, sharp. Her eyes missed nothing. She asked to speak somewhere private. We sat at the kitchen table, and she laid out the new pieces. The SEC had acknowledged receipt of the package, quietly. No flags raised yet, but the case had been assigned a preliminary investigator. That meant it wasn't being dismissed. That meant someone, somewhere, had read the material and seen enough to keep looking. She also had something else. A call log from an anonymous source inside the finance department. A man who had been working under Ronan for the last 2 years. According to him, Ronan had ordered unusual consolidation of vendor accounts, pushing through backdated invoices from companies with vague service descriptions. One in particular stood out. Garris and Flint, a so-called consulting firm that hadn't filed a single legitimate invoice until 6 months after I stepped down. Layla showed me the invoices. I knew immediately. Garris and Flint was a shadow account. The numbers didn't match any department spending patterns. The supposed services were never requested. And worse, they had been used to route nearly $400,000 into offshore transfers labeled as strategic development funds. It wasn't just internal fraud anymore. It was laundering, on a scale that could trigger federal investigation. Layla warned me to stay quiet. For now, it wasn't time to confront Ronan. That would only give him a chance to cover tracks. We needed one more thing. A direct link between the falsified signature and his approval, a bridge between the legal manipulation and his own gain. That night, I sat in bed, my journal open beside me. I hadn't written in it for years. The last entry was from the week after my husband's funeral. Now I turned the page and began again. Not with rage, not with grief, but with facts. What I knew. What I suspected, what I remembered. As I wrote, I began to see him clearly for the first time. Ronan. Not the man who helped me carry boxes into our first office space. Not the one who once told me he admired how I built something from nothing. No. This was the man who saw value in structure, not people. The kind of man who kept his promises vague and his alibis rehearsed. And he was slipping. Because greed always rushes ahead of caution. The next day, I returned to the office, not through the front. I still had access to the side entrance for deliveries. Inside, the halls were quiet. Most of the senior staff worked remote now. The place felt cold, unfamiliar. I walked past framed awards I had once been proud of, now gathering dust. I went to the records room. There, in a locked drawer I knew still held archived physical contracts, I found what I was looking for. A quarterly report from 2 years ago, the last one I had personally approved. I compared my actual signature on the cover page to the one Ronan had forged in the memo. It was almost perfect. Almost. But I noticed something. The spacing between the middle initials and the surname was slightly wider in the forged copy. Enough that a forensic handwriting expert could pick it apart. Enough that a good lawyer could use it to build doubt in front of a jury. I scanned it, sent it to Layla. She didn't respond right away, but a few hours later, she sent back a short reply. Now we can proceed. I didn't celebrate. I just stood in the middle of my living room, hands at my sides, and closed my eyes. The wind outside shifted. The house creaked softly. It was a sound I had heard for decades, and yet it felt like something new now. Something was beginning, and I was ready for it. I met Layla again on a cold Wednesday morning. We chose a quiet cafe outside the city this time, one of those old diners with cracked leather booths and endless coffee refills. She had already ordered tea by the time I arrived, her briefcase resting on the seat beside her. She looked tired, but focused. When she saw me, she gave a small nod and pushed a folder across the table. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a forensic report. Clean, clinical, detailed. It confirmed what we had suspected. My signature had been lifted from a prior report, digitally traced and pasted onto the new one. Microscopic inconsistencies in stroke pressure and spacing were now catalogued and time-stamped. It wasn't just a copy, it was a calculated fabrication. The second document was a financial audit. Not complete, but damning enough. Over the course of 18 months, funds had been rerouted through 5 separate shell vendors, all tied back to a single IP address. That address, Layla said, was traced to a server once used exclusively by Ronan's personal assistant, but only after office hours, only after my retirement. I didn't react right away. I let the information sit there in the silence, pressing against the inside of my ribs. Then Layla said the part that changed everything. Ronan had filed a counterclaim. 2 days after the SEC received my submission, he had quietly preempted any investigation by submitting a fabricated report of his own, one that portrayed me as unstable. It was subtle, clever. He referenced vague financial irregularities from my last year as CEO, suggested my declining mental state could have resulted in unintentional oversights. There was even a line stating he had grave concerns about my capacity to manage funds independently. He was trying to discredit me before the facts could speak. I looked at Layla. She didn't flinch. She had seen this tactic before. We moved quickly after that. I recorded a statement. Not for the media, not yet, but for legal proceedings. I spoke clearly, methodically. I listed dates, names, documents. I described conversations with Ronan word for word, even the ones I had once brushed off as flattery. I described how he slowly removed trusted staff, how he restructured reporting lines to funnel everything through him. I described the day I was asked to step down for optics. I ended with the forged signature and the accounts that didn't exist when I was CEO. Then we waited. 2 weeks passed. Then, late one night, my phone buzzed. It was a restricted number. A man's voice, polite, measured, from the office of the Inspector General. He asked to confirm a few details. Then he thanked me. I asked if this meant they were opening a formal case. He didn't answer directly, but I heard what he didn't say. The next day, Ronan's name disappeared from the company website. It was subtle, no announcement, no farewell message, just gone. I didn't celebrate. I just walked to the garden and sat among the rosemary and thyme. I listened to the wind. I watched a bee burrow into a blossom. That night, Layla called. There had been a quiet agreement behind closed doors. Ronan would step aside voluntarily while the board conducted an internal review. It wasn't an admission of guilt, but it was a crack in the armor, and that was all we needed. The board reached out. Not to apologize, not exactly, but to ask if I'd consider returning as a consultant. They said they wanted stability, familiarity. They framed it as respect. I declined. I had no desire to sit in the same rooms with the same men who watched me be erased in real time and said nothing. Instead, I made a different call. I reached out to Marla. She had worked in operations for 20 years before Ronan demoted her. She was sharp, efficient, kind. I told her I wanted to create something new, a foundation, not a company, a space for women in leadership over 60, a place where their voices wouldn't be condescended to, but centered. She said yes before I could finish my sentence. In the weeks that followed, I gathered names, women I'd mentored over the years, women who had left the corporate world because it demanded their silence. I brought them together, not as advisors, but as founders. The foundation grew quickly, quietly. We didn't need headlines, we needed momentum. One afternoon, as I was reviewing an application, I saw an email notification. It was from the SEC. They had opened a formal investigation. The email was brief, factual, but it was real. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not victory, but clarity. This wasn't about revenge. This was about truth, about dignity, about the quiet, steady power of not giving up when the world expects you to fade. That night, I sat alone on the porch, the sun dipping low. I wasn't broken. I wasn't done. I was just beginning something else entirely. The investigation was no longer mine to push forward. It had taken on a life of its own. But that didn't mean I stepped away. In fact, the quieter the legal process became, the more deliberate my next steps had to be. I met with Layla again, this time not as a client, but as a collaborator. We sat in the back of the Foundation's small office, surrounded by dusty books and cardboard boxes still unpacked. I told her I wanted to establish a legal resource fund, not for myself, but for older women pushed out of corporate leadership and gaslighted into thinking they were too fragile, too outdated, too emotional to be trusted with power. She didn't hesitate. She offered to structure it herself. Pro bono. I began writing a letter, not to the board, not to Ronan, but to every woman I had mentored during my 30 years in that company. I told them what happened without rage or embellishment, just facts. I told them about the forged documents, the false claims, the quiet erasure. I told them what came after. Then I invited them to build something with me. Responses trickled in. Then they flooded. One by one they came forward. Stories that mirrored mine. Stories worse than mine. Retirements that were not retirements. Restructures that came with gag orders. Raises that vanished when maternity was mentioned. Every sentence ended in silence. Not anymore. With Layla's help, we crafted a formal complaint package to send directly to the Department of Labor. We filed under a clause that covered discriminatory dismissal patterns, ageism, and targeted succession manipulation. It wasn't about bringing the company down. It was about cracking open a truth that had stayed polished and hidden for decades. The Foundation's phone began to ring more often. Some calls came from women I had never met. Others came from journalists who sensed something brewing but couldn't yet name it. I didn't take those calls. Not yet. Instead, I focused on what I could control. I hired Marla full-time to lead program development. She recruited 2 women from her network, both over 60, both previously vice presidents in firms that treated them like relics. Together, they built a curriculum on leadership re-entry, negotiation for women over 50, and legal navigation after forced exits. We didn't just give out advice. We gave tools, funding, space. Then the first board member from my old company resigned. He claimed it was for health reasons. 2 days later, another quietly stepped down. It wasn't a storm, it wasn't scandal, it was slow erosion, and it was working. By the time the SEC issued their first subpoena, Ronan had gone silent, no press release, no public appearance, just absence. His once busy LinkedIn account hadn't been updated in weeks. Someone else began attending public meetings in his place. But I wasn't watching him anymore. I was watching the women coming in through the doors of our new space. Some walked in upright and confident. Others came in shoulders hunched, eyes wary. Most were carrying something invisible: doubt, shame, silence. We welcomed them anyway. One afternoon, I sat with a woman named Diane. She had been a senior compliance officer before she was told her tone made people uncomfortable. She had internalized it, nearly apologized for it, until she read our open letter online. That day, she told me she hadn't cried in 3 years. Then she wept. She wasn't alone. None of us were. It was around that time the media finally caught on. The story broke without my name attached. Just a headline about an anonymous former CEO who had triggered a quiet but growing inquiry into executive misconduct, forgery, and forced succession inside a publicly traded firm. The article quoted 2 sources close to the case. It ended with a line about a parallel grassroots movement of retired corporate women forming a legal coalition. That was us. I didn't need to read the comments. The people who mattered were already calling. 2 local universities offered partnerships. One invited me to speak. I declined. I wasn't ready to become a symbol. I just wanted to build something real. And I was building it. Brick by quiet brick. Still, not all messages were kind. A letter arrived at the foundation, unsigned. Inside, a clipped article about our investigation. Scribbled in red ink were the words, "Stay in your lane, know your place." I folded the letter once, then again, and placed it in my drawer. It would stay there, not as a threat, as a reminder that when you make noise without yelling, when you step out of silence with poise instead of fury, you still disturb the ones who counted on your disappearance. That was the part they never understood. I didn't need a title anymore. I didn't need a seat at their table. I had built my own. And women were arriving with their own chairs. The board's silence didn't fool me. I had worked too long in that building to mistake calm for peace. What was brewing behind those closed doors wasn't retreat. It was calculation. I knew Ronan wouldn't take this quietly forever. And I was right. It started with a notice, a simple envelope delivered to the foundation's address, bearing the logo of my former company. Inside, a formal statement requesting my presence at a closed review of my past tenure. The letter used vague phrases like procedural clarification and records reconciliation. But I understood what it really was. They were going to try to discredit me, discredit my work, my memory, my integrity. Ronan was using the strategy I'd seen him perfect over years. Not open confrontation, but quiet unraveling. Whisper campaigns, polite questions in the right ears, shadows of doubt sown carefully until people forgot what they had seen and remembered only what they had heard. This time, I wouldn't be silent. I gave the letter to Layla, who read it with a controlled expression, then reached into her bag and pulled out a file. It was my employment record, the real one, and a copy of the forged version they had submitted during the leadership transition. We had everything we needed, but we weren't going to play defense. We would go first. We drafted a formal demand for a full audit, not of my decisions, but of the board's transactions in the 6 months leading to my exit. We cited financial inconsistencies in project allocations, unusual wire transfers flagged by 2 former internal auditors who had joined our cause, and a missing report tied to a charitable fund that no longer existed. Then we sent a copy, not just to the board. We sent it to the SEC. Ronan's reply didn't come through paper. It came through people. Over the next week, I received 5 separate calls from old colleagues. Most began the same way. Awkward greetings, polite questions, a strange edge in their voices. They were fishing for my side of the story, but I could hear the undertone. He was calling them, one by one, trying to build doubt, rewrite history, and yet something was different. This time, they weren't buying it as quickly. I could tell. They had seen too much already. The resignations, the silence from the executive wing, the article that hadn't used my name, but that everyone recognized anyway. The illusion was cracking. Then came the invitation. A private event. A leadership summit hosted by one of the largest non-profit boards in the state. I was listed as a panelist, seated next to two former CEOs, one of whom had stepped down after a very public harassment lawsuit. My instincts said to decline, but Layla urged me to go. Not for recognition, she said, but for documentation. So I went. I wore a simple black suit, no makeup, no speech prepared. When the moderator introduced me, there was a brief pause in the room. Recognition flickered across a few faces. One woman nodded slowly, as if confirming a guess she had held quietly. They asked about succession planning. I didn't speak in theories. I told them what happened. No bitterness, just the truth. And I watched the air shift. After the panel, a woman in her early 40s approached me. She had just taken a VP role in a mid-size firm. She whispered that after hearing me speak, she had cancelled a succession agreement she'd been pressured into signing. Her voice shook when she thanked me. That night, I sat in my car for a long time before driving home. The lights of the city blurred in the windshield, and I felt something unexpected. Not victory, not relief, just clarity. They had tried to erase me quietly, but every step they took to silence me only made the truth louder. 2 days later, a headline ran in the business section of the Tribune. It was short. SEC requests internal audit of Halverston and Lake following allegations of financial mismanagement. No quotes, no names, just that sentence. I printed it out and pinned it in the hallway of the foundation, next to a photo of the first 10 women who joined our legal support program. That was enough. The foundation began receiving requests for interviews, journalists, scholars, even documentary producers. I turned most down. This wasn't about becoming a figurehead, it was about becoming free. Still, something inside me knew it wasn't over. Ronan hadn't responded directly yet. And a man like him, a man who built his power through manipulation and precision, wouldn't fade quietly. He was planning something, and I needed to be ready. The night before the board's scheduled quarterly dinner, I didn't sleep. Not from anxiety, but from clarity. Every detail was prepared. Every file had been cross-checked. Every clause in the bylaws that had been ignored over the years was highlighted and annotated. This dinner wasn't a reunion. It was an unveiling. I arrived at the restaurant early, not for show, but for position. The private room was dimly lit, with heavy wood walls and white linen draped across a long table. I chose my seat at the far end, the one facing the entrance. When the others trickled in, 7 board members and Ronan at the center, I greeted them politely. I smiled as if this were any other gathering. A part of me still recognized them not just as adversaries, but as former colleagues. People I had once respected. People who had once respected me. Until ambition rewrote the script. Wine was poured, toasts were raised, they spoke of new partnerships and impressive numbers. No one mentioned the SEC, no one mentioned the audit. It was as if silence would somehow erase the shadow hanging over the company. Then Ronan leaned back and looked at me. His tone was controlled, almost warm. He thanked me for attending. said it was good to have us all together. And then he slid a folder across the table. A single sheet inside. It was a settlement offer. They were trying to buy me out. In exchange for a non-disclosure agreement, they would grant me a partial severance and a vague acknowledgement of my years of service. The language was careful. No mention of wrongdoing, no admission of fault. Just a quiet exit. A deal meant to disappear. I didn't touch the paper. I opened my own folder and laid it beside his. Mine held copies of internal emails Ronan thought were deleted. A whistleblower from the financial team had recovered them. They revealed asset redirection, fund mislabeling, and falsified board signatures. My name wasn't just missing from those documents. It had been replaced. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. I stood slowly and addressed the table. I spoke clearly, without emotion. I described the breach of fiduciary duty. I outlined the clauses that had been violated. I explained the full consequences of the audit findings if released publicly. I made it plain that if forced, I would take the story further. And then I paused, and I offered them an option. I proposed a structural transition. Ronan would step down within 30 days. An independent committee would oversee financial reform. The foundation would become a permanent stakeholder in future decisions. And I would say nothing more. Not because I was being silenced, but because justice had already begun. The table was quiet for a long time. One of the board members, a woman named Charlotte, broke the silence. She said she had reviewed the documents ahead of time, had already reached out to legal counsel, and that she supported the proposal. Another followed, then another. Ronan remained seated, hands folded, jaw tight. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. He had already lost. I walked out before dessert was served. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and allowed myself to exhale for the first time in weeks. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't glory. It was completion. The next morning, the foundation received a formal letter. Ronan's resignation, effective immediately. No excuses, no public statement. Just the end of a long, exhausting chapter. 2 days later, Charlotte called. She offered to meet at a small cafe near the university campus. When I arrived, she had already ordered coffee. She thanked me, not just for what I had done, but for how I had done it. Quietly, strategically, with dignity. She said the company had been veering off course for years, that I had simply been the first to name it. I didn't correct her. There was nothing to add. After she left, I sat in the cafe for a while. I watched students walk past the window, backpacks slung over shoulders, full of urgency and dreams. I remembered what it felt like to be that young, to believe that fairness was a given. I don't believe that anymore. But I believe in clarity, and I believe in action. At home, I updated the foundation website. We added a new page dedicated to ethics in corporate transitions. We offered free templates, legal references, and anonymous counseling for senior professionals facing manipulation. By the end of the month, 5 new cases had come in. 5 people like me, older, dismissed, but no longer silent. The damage Ronan tried to do hadn't disappeared. It had just shifted. But now it was visible. And that, more than anything, was the win. It wasn't loud. It wasn't celebrated. But it was complete. In the weeks after Ronan's resignation, my life returned to something I almost didn't recognize. Not because everything was quiet, but because the noise was finally my own. I started waking up without checking my phone first. The emails had slowed. No more board memos, no calendar invites layered with ulterior motives. I brewed my coffee slowly, the way I used to before everything became about control and preparation. It was strange at first. the stillness. After decades of building and fighting and protecting, it felt like I had stepped off a moving train. But there was no crash, just quiet ground. I began going through old boxes in the attic, not out of nostalgia, but necessity. I had been postponing it for years. Folders, photo albums, letters from my late husband tucked into cookbooks and random drawers. It was all there, waiting for the right kind of silence. One afternoon, I found a cassette tape, labeled in my handwriting, my son's first piano recital. I sat on the floor and held it like it was a relic. And maybe it was. A time capsule from before ambition hardened him, before life twisted us both in directions we hadn't predicted. There were no tears, but I sat there a long time. Later that week, I had dinner with my neighbor Adele. She was in her 60s, divorced twice, bright as a whip, and completely uninterested in small talk. Over lemon chicken and roasted asparagus, she asked how things were going. I told her the truth. I said I was tired, but not the kind of tired that sleep could fix. I said I had carried weight for so long that now, without it, I wasn't sure what to do with my hands. She didn't respond right away. She just nodded, poured more wine, and told me about her herb garden. Mint and sage, mostly, said they kept her company. The next morning, I planted thyme by the back window, not for cooking, just to see it grow. I started walking again, not to chase thoughts or plans, but just to move. I walked past the bakery where Ronan and I used to buy muffins on Sundays. I didn't turn away. I didn't feel anger, just distance, like remembering a version of myself that no longer fit. I also began receiving letters, handwritten ones, from women I didn't know. Some had read about the audit in an obscure industry report. Others had heard from whispers in academic circles. But they all shared one thing. They were tired too. Tired of being erased quietly. Tired of being the backbone and then being called the burden. Tired of fighting without armor. They didn't ask for advice. They just told me their stories. And I read every single one. One woman was a retired chemist whose son sold her house while she was on a medical trip. Another was a librarian pushed out of her community center by a younger board who said she lacked digital skills. I began collecting their stories, not to publish, not to expose, but to witness, because that's what had been missing all along. Someone to say, "I see you." I reached out to a friend from my early days in administration, Helen. She ran a small press now, mostly memoirs and community essays. I asked her what it would take to build a resource, something digital but personal, a platform where women could archive their experiences without shame. Not a blog, not a brand, a haven. She said she'd help, so we started slowly. A simple name, a clean design, no pop-ups, no ads, just stories, raw and true. The first week we had 5 submissions. By the end of the month, there were 43. I wasn't a CEO anymore, but I was a keeper of truths. One day I received an email from my son's assistant, a short note saying he would be in town, passing through on a speaking engagement. There was no apology, no pretense, just a mention that he would stop by if I was open to it. I closed the message without responding, not out of anger, but because silence can be sacred too. A few nights later, I stood in the hallway outside my study, lights off, house still, and listened to the tick of the clock on the mantel. It was an antique piece my husband had restored in the early years. The sound used to annoy me when I was buried in deadlines. Now it felt like proof of time, of survival. I had lost thing I would never get back. Not just people or titles, but versions of myself. The one who believed loyalty protected you. The one who trusted without reading between the lines. But in their place, Something quieter had grown. Not stronger, not louder, just more rooted. And that somehow felt like enough. That winter, I sat down to write the story of the board meeting, not for public record, but for myself, to see it plainly, to know that I had not imagined it, that what I did mattered, even if no one clapped. When I finished, I didn't cry. I just saved the file and turned off the computer. Then I made tea, wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, and watched the snow fall from the kitchen window. Not chasing thoughts, not planning comebacks, just being. Alive. And finally mine. I didn't expect to hear from Judith again, but life has a way of circling back when the dust begins to settle. She called late one afternoon. Her voice, once brisk and clipped, had lost some of its edges. She didn't ask how I was. She simply said she had something for me, and if I was willing, she would come by that Friday. I said yes. There were no nerves when she arrived. I didn't rush to clean or fuss with tea. I just opened the door and stood aside as she stepped in, carrying a slim folder under one arm. She looked different. Not older, just less armored. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I used to prepare reports for late-night calls. Now it held 2 mugs of rooibos tea and the faint scent of lemon polish. Judith opened the folder. Inside were 3 items. A notarized document transferring full ownership of a property I hadn't seen in years. A handwritten letter from a retired board member, and a copy of Ronan's recent deposition from the ethics investigation tied to another company he had invested in. He had crumbled. Badly. Judith didn't look smug, just tired. She said she thought I should have these. Not to hurt him, not to gloat, but to know. To know that silence sometimes works louder than noise. I didn't ask for details. She didn't offer many. But she did say one thing before leaving. She said she had underestimated me, and that now she wouldn't make that mistake again. When the door closed behind her, I sat for a long time. I wasn't surprised by Ronan's fall. Not anymore. But there was something sharp in reading it, in seeing in black and white how far he had slipped, and how much of that fall had started with what he did to me. But even as I held the papers, I felt no desire to strike back. Because the worst part wasn't the fraud or the betrayal. It was that he had traded something sacred for power that didn't last. And I had finally stopped doing that. The next week, Helen and I finalized the beta version of the archive site. It wasn't flashy, just functional. But it was clean, safe, and easy to navigate. We uploaded 20 stories the first day, all anonymous unless the writer asked otherwise. Some were short, some were sprawling, but every one of them carried weight. There was a janitor who had built a literacy program for her neighborhood, a nurse practitioner whose children drained her retirement fund while praising her sacrifice, a grandmother who was evicted from her own home after co-signing a loan for her daughter. Different names, same ache. I didn't moderate the comments. I didn't edit the voice. I let them speak as they needed. And every night, I read a few. Not all at once. Just enough to stay connected. The following month, a university in Oregon reached out. A professor had found the site and asked if I would speak to her class about legacy and quiet power. I declined the public appearance, but offered to write a letter they could read aloud. In that letter, I didn't tell them how to lead or what to avoid. I told them how I learned the difference between fear and clarity. Fear makes you fight everything. Clarity lets you walk away from what was never yours to hold. As spring arrived, I noticed the thyme had spread into the corner near the fence. Its soft, purple flowers brushed against the brick. It wasn't much, but it was alive. And it had grown without needing attention, just space. One morning, as I watered the porch plants, The mail truck pulled up. The driver, a young woman with tired eyes, handed me a small package and paused. She said she had been reading the stories, that they mattered. Then she left. I didn't know her name, but I knew her face. That quiet kind of recognition. That look of someone who had held too much for too long and had finally set something down. I opened the package on the kitchen counter. It was a book of essays from a small publishing house. Tucked inside was a note. No signature, just 6 words. Thank you for breaking the silence. That night, I slept without dreams. Not because I had no more questions, but because I finally knew which ones were mine to carry. It's been 8 months since I stepped away, not from the world, but from the part of me that always tried to prove I was worth keeping. I still get up early. I still make tea the same way. But now I don't reach for the phone before the water boils. I let silence stretch across the kitchen like an old quilt. Familiar, warm, not empty, just enough. Helen visits on Thursdays. She brings lemon bread, and we talk about nothing urgent. The site has grown quietly. No sponsors, no loud praise. But people come back. They leave stories like folded notes in a wooden drawer, and I keep them safe. One woman wrote about cleaning the office floor of a CEO who never learned her name. Another spoke of raising 3 sons and being told at 70 that she was just a burden now. I never respond. But I read every line. I see myself in the spaces between their sentences. The archive is not just a project anymore. It's a place. A kind of home for voices that were once too soft to be heard. I don't need to lead it. I just tend to it. The way you water a plant not for show, but because it deserves to live. Ronan never reached out. Not after the deposition, not after the stories began to travel. And I didn't expect him to. I think he knows that if he came to my door now, he wouldn't find the woman he used to manipulate. He would find someone who sees right through the performance. Judith sent one final email. No words, just a scanned photo from 20 years ago. It was me, standing in front of the community center, holding a certificate I barely remembered receiving. Her subject line read, "You were never invisible." I saved it, not for memory, but as proof, but as that sometimes the world catches up to the truth you always carried. On the first morning of summer, I sat on the porch with my feet bare and a notebook in my lap. I didn't write anything for hours, just watched the wind stir the ivy, watched the mail truck pass without stopping. I used to think healing would feel like fireworks. It doesn't. It feels like getting dressed slowly with no one watching. It feels like not explaining, not defending, just being. There's no parade at the end of a quiet war, only peace. And peace is soft. It doesn't shout your name. It just waits until you're ready. So here I am, not younger, not harder, just honest. I still think of the woman I was the day I cleared out that office, holding my last check like a wound, trying to smile for the security guard on my way out. I wish I could go back and whisper to her, "You didn't lose. You finally stopped playing their game. And now, without their rules, you're free." If any part of my story touched something quiet inside you, maybe it's time to listen to that part. The one that has stayed silent for too long. You don't need a microphone. You don't need permission. You just need space. And if you have your own story that was once buried under shame, I invite you to leave it in the comments below. Not for applause, just for yourself. Sometimes the act of telling is the first step back to yourself.